Welcome back to another episode. Today's topic is the College Board. I'm not sure if you've been checking out the news, but there's big changes, big sweeping changes that have been happening at the College Board. And so we get a little glimpse of that looking at the newspaper, Washington Post. And the question you need to ask yourself is, how does that actually impact education? So the big controversy, and I have a source from inside that gave me the scoop, was that with the pandemic hitting our educational institutions, most particularly elementary schools, high schools, middle schools, and the like, the College Board has not been able to have students take the SATs, or not as many students take the SATs. Now, if you're not familiar with the SATs are the Standard Aptitude Test. If you're of my generation, you recognize how incredibly important the SATs were to the bottom line as far as getting into a good college or university. So when you're going through high school and you're studying, you're getting good grades, all of that paled in comparison to how you were actually going to do on the SATs. And so if you took the SATs like I did, I'm sure you have a memory and some stories as far as maybe how you're stressed out a little bit, the preparation you did, and essentially all of that to get the best score you possibly could, and that would essentially dictate your future, right? So that's what the SATs, that's the importance of what the SATs in my mind have always been. What college or university are you going to get into? And your SAT scores essentially will dictate that for you. So I was incredibly fortunate to do pretty well on my SATs, and I got into the first choice that I was looking for, Carnegie Mellon University, and had a great time there. And I look now to see what's actually happening, and because of the pandemic, if students aren't able to take the SATs, what actually happens to them getting into college? And so the news, as far as the impact on education, is that if students aren't able to take the SATs, what happens? So the colleges, at least within 2020, have elected to make the SATs optional. And that's a really big deal. It may not seem like a big deal, but it's a really big deal. And the reason being is because there were about 7 to 8 million students each year that actually took the SATs. And there were also other subject tests such as SAT 2s and some other exams that were being offered. And SATs were, again, the big deal, but they've always kind of were growing in magnitude and what they were working to test and everything. And making the SAT optional is very interesting in regards to applying for schools, because normally based on your SAT scores, you would look to see, does that SAT score match up with the folks that are admitted into this school? Yes or no? And so that almost was your selection criteria. But making SATs optional, that opens the door wide open where students can apply anywhere they want to go, and the SATs aren't a restriction that's necessarily holding them back anymore. So if you really think about it, who were the folks that were actually doing really well in the SATs? The question is, were they going to be any more successful than someone who didn't do well in the SATs? And so I wanted to dive into that a little bit to really get an understanding of what the SATs actually represent and what they actually represent now. So we talked about what they meant, right? It was, if you did well in the SATs, you're getting into a great school. And I remember an article just a few years ago in regards to a student in our local area, in the Virginia area. They got a perfect 1,600 on her SATs and pretty much just had all the Ivy League schools just kind of lining up to take her in, right? And so obviously if you do very well in the test, colleges look at that and they say, okay, well, you know what? You already fit within our criteria. You're good to go. But if you don't, do the colleges give you a second look? And so the real question is, do tests actually, they can help and they can hurt? And the question is, for a student's success, is that something that's going to mess up the bottom line? And so that's what the SATs used to mean. Now, with the SATs being optional, it's really a question of, are students actually going to take the SATs? And if they do take the SATs, are they going to choose to actually reveal those scores or not to the colleges and universities they're applying to? Because if it helps them, yes, that's more padding, on the application. But if it doesn't, do they just kind of scrub it all together? And that's a very, very interesting question that we actually have that we're going to have to figure out how to deal with. So the SATs now, students can't actually take them, right? So if students can't take them, what does that actually mean? Well, SATs are optional, but some students are actually still within that mindset of, I need to get a good score in the SATs, and that'll open the doors for me. So you have some folks that are still in that old mindset, and then some folks that are taking advantage of how things have actually shifted. And so the College Board just made an announcement that they are actually scrubbing the SAT 2 test as well as the optional essay. For anyone who is familiar how the SATs change, it used to be based on a score of 1,600 with an 800 score for verbal, 800 score for math, and then they added an optional essay. Well, now I think they're scaling that back, and they're just making it the math and the verbal, and they're scrubbing the SAT 2s altogether. Now, one big challenge that the College Board has is they have to figure out how to take an industry practice written test that's been that way for generations into a digital format. And that's a huge undertaking for a company that has focused mostly on the paper side of things. So that's going to be interesting to see and kind of tell what happens. But what's more important is what's happened over the last year. If the SATs are optional and some colleges and universities were looking at possibly making that an optional or sort of bypassing the SATs altogether, what does that mean for students? Does that actually open more doors? So if we look at education, what is education exactly? Well, if you look at the game Monopoly, it's not very different from the game Monopoly. So if we actually look at how Monopoly is played, we'll probably get a little bit better sense of how the education system actually works and kind of how the College Board fits in and what that actually means as far as, some of the mobility within it. So if you were to ask me, what does Monopoly actually look like when you consider education? Well, it represents the American dream. So as you start playing Monopoly, you start going around the board, you want to get as much income as you possibly can. You want to buy real estate. You want to do all these various things to make your life better. But the way the American dream is actually packaged and sold is actually really important. What you may not recognize is before you can actually buy any property, you might actually have to go around the board a couple times. Or maybe that's not even part of your strategy. And sometimes, well, not sometimes, part of the strategy to win a monopoly is to create a monopoly. But if you just go around the board and keep pass and go, you get a salary, right? So that's kind of one piece as far as kind of how monopoly is played and how that education system is put into presence. The other piece is a high price, right? The higher the price, the easier it is to push folks out of the board. And that can be something that can actually create moats or division. And again, it shouldn't necessarily be that way for education, but unfortunately it is. And then there's this idea of pedigree and entitlement. So if someone's already, done well on the monopoly board and has a monopoly, then they can just pass that on to their children, right? And so this whole idea of meritocracy, does that actually exist or not, right? You might have, some cronyism in there. So you have a system that was designed to create employees. That's what monopoly actually is. It's a system designed to create employees. And if you want to know more in depth as far as how that actually happens, definitely check out escapethemonopoly.com where you get the full scoop of what's actually happening in the game Monopoly that you may not have actually recognized. But continuing on, what are the myths? What are the myths associated with this idea of education? And I think the first one is that you have to go to a college or university to be successful. That's something that I believe is ingrained in students, and they aren't given enough options to understand what are the possibilities. They just see that as a single possibility. So that's a myth. If you look at some of the great entrepreneurs that are out there, their mindsets were very different than what they were actually being taught in colleges and universities. And so they took a different route. It's not necessarily for everybody, but it should be an option for folks to actually consider. Another piece of that is the more you have, the better you are. We work in a class system where if you have a lot of money, you have a different class. You're at a different social echelon. And with that, it can feel as though the people that have the money have everything, but that's not necessarily true. Everybody has problems. But the way society actually portrays that, we don't see that. We just see the folks that actually have a lot of money not having as many problems, but that is not true. So the more you have, it does not mean the better you are. It just means that you're dealing with different types of problems. As far as the college university, it does not determine what your success will actually be. Based on the school you get in, it doesn't determine how well you're actually going to do. So that's actually something important to consider. Usually we want to get into the best school we possibly can, but we don't necessarily think of the bottom line that actually creates, or what the results actually are from that. The other piece is the amount of money you spend for school does not essentially dictate a student's success. It may improve their ability to succeed, but it's not a barometer saying, oh, the more money you spend on the education, the better it's going to be. Actually, there's probably a plateau there where the more you spend, you're not actually going to be doing any better there. And then the only way to succeed in a capitalist market is to be an employee. That's what the game Monopoly kind of teaches a little bit. But the way that our students are taught to play Monopoly essentially is creating that restriction, that point where things are actually getting stuck. So that's something to think about, right? If you take all of that and you see how the College Board actually fits in, the SATs don't determine how much money you will make. They actually did a survey of that, looking at SAT scores and correlating that to salary, and there was no correlation. So that's interesting. That's really interesting. And it's interesting because of this last point. I consider this last point the wisdom of the entire presentation today on the College Board. And the wisdom is this: financial intelligence, a topic that is not taught in school, will determine how little you need to actually get what you want. And that seems kind of backward, right? Because don't we want more? Well, we want to be able to do more with what we have. I think that's a better mindset to actually think about. But financial intelligence will actually allow you to use less to actually do more. And man, that's just mind-blowing, right? So with everything going on, the College Board is definitely changing things up. The game Monopoly, as far as education and what we know it, is changing up. Doors are opening up. And I hope you join me in getting a better sense of, well, what's to come. So again, more information available at escapemonopoly.com. See where you actually rank up. Remember, there are 4 other things you can be other than an employee. And you can only learn that at Escape the Monopoly. So I appreciate you tuning in. I hope you learned a little bit about the College Board and how the game of education is changing. And if you're a parent, hopefully you're sharing this with your kids. If you're a kid or a student, hopefully you're sharing this with your friends and with your parents. And I'll catch you on the next episode. All right. Bye.